me breaking in the front.
Yeah. No, you see my gray hair.
No, we had gotten through verse 18. We had heard about Nebuchadnezzar's dream as he reported it. Remember, we had this interesting chapter where essentially this story has been kind of dropped right here in the middle of Daniel chapter 4. Nebuchadnezzar begins by telling the story through verse 18, and then in verse 19, where we'll start today, Daniel picks up the story from his perspective. It's just an interesting dynamic, from who's telling the story anyway. So we heard about this tree that grows very large and eventually gets chopped down, and now it's time for Daniel to interpret the dream, and so we begin that in verse 19. So I'll just start reading there. So it says, "Then Daniel, whose name was Belteshazzar, was astonished for a time, and his thoughts troubled him. And so the king spoke and says, Belteshazzar, do not let the dream or its interpretation trouble you. Belteshazzar answered and said, My lord, may the dream concern those who hate you, and its interpretation concern your enemies." So first of all, my version says that Daniel, whose name was Belteshazzar, was astonished. Do you have a different word there instead of astonished?
Greatly perplexed.
Dismayed. Appalled.
Mine says astonished for a time. Does yours have some kind of time?
For a while.
For a while. For a time.
For a while.
So it appears that more than anything else, I think what happened here was that Daniel paused and didn't very quickly respond to the king. The king asked him for the interpretation. Daniel does a little hesitant pause here, and I think the question then is, why does Daniel pause before he gives this answer to the king? Your thoughts?
It's not good news.
Yeah, it's
bad news.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's exactly it, right? I mean, I think he actually had, again, he's been with Nebuchadnezzar now for 50 years or so. He's developed a relationship with Nebuchadnezzar, and he's about to bring him some really bad news. And so, for one reason, simply that he cared for and had concern for Nebuchadnezzar. And secondly, as we may have mentioned before, bringing bad news to the king, not a good idea. So there may have been a little hitch in him thinking, gee, do I really want to share this with the king? I really think it's more the first, where he really had this relationship. It really broke his heart to think about saying this to the king, his friend, someone he'd been praying with for years, right? Someone who he wants to develop a relationship with God. And he ends it with the statement. Mine says, may the Lord's dream concern those who hate you, and its interpretation concern your enemies. In other words, saying, I really wish this dream on your enemies. I really wish that it concerned them rather than concerning you. Again, because it was so bad. So anyway, so then he goes on to the dream in verse 20. The tree that you saw, which grew and became strong, whose height reached to the heavens, and which could be seen by all the earth, whose leaves were lovely, its fruit abundant, and which was food for all, under which the beasts of the field dwelt, and all the branches, the birds of the heaven in their home. It is you, O king, who have grown and become strong, for your greatness has grown and reaches to the heaven, and your dominion to the ends of the earth. So I think the first part, don't miss beginning of verse 22, right? It is you, O king. I mean, he had the guts to say, this dream's about you, where I think, as we talked about last week, I think the rest of the wise men, they were not willing to go out on that branch and say, no, this is you, O king, this is about you. So the guts that Daniel has to do that, and again, based on this relationship that he's able to share, all this news with him, is pretty important. Now, this is obviously the good part of the news, right? The king's probably loving this interpretation at this point, right? He's this wonderful branch. He provides food and shelter, and he does all these great things. I think that, at this point in time, Daniel's probably Nebuchadnezzar's thinking, yeah, this is about me. But again, this whole thing is about to change as we get to verse 23. All right, so verse 23, and then as much as the king saw a watcher, a holy one, coming down from heaven and saying, chop down the tree and destroy it, but leave its stump and roots in the earth, bound with a band of iron, bronze in the tender grass of the field, let it be wet with dew. In the heaven, let him graze in the beasts of the field, till 7 times pass over him. This is the interpretation, O king, and this is the decree of the Most High, which has come upon my lord the king. So before I go into verse 25, in verse 24, again, remember we talked last week, this watcher, this holy one, we're talking about an angel. It's one being, right, who's called 2 different names there, a watcher and a holy one, who comes down to give this message, just to remind you of that. And then in verse 24, he kind of says, okay, just to let you know, king, this is not my opinion. This is coming from God, right? This is from the Most High. He doesn't say that about the good part. When he gets to the tough part, he says, oh, by the way, this is God who's passing this on to you. Anyway, verse 25, they shall drive you from men. Your dwelling shall be with the beasts of the field, and they shall make you eat grass like oxen. They shall wet you with the dew of heaven, and 7 times shall pass over you, until you know that the Most High rules in the kingdom of men and gives it to whomever he chooses. So, the key thing in this verse, you may see it, right, is that he's focused in on you, right? It's you who are going to eat the grass. It's you going to get the dew of heaven. It's you who have to understand that the Most High rules. He's making this a very personal vision, right? He's not backing off at all. It's you. All these things are going to happen to. It's not someone else. So I think that's, again, shows the guts of Daniel in the midst of what's happening here. The other thing is, mine says, they shall drive you, they shall make you, they shall do this. So who's the they? Any thoughts? Everybody's looking at their notes to see what it says. Let's see. So let me just answer the question. There is no they. This is a interpretation problem in going from the original language to English. He's really just saying that it will happen to you. You will be driven would really be a better interpretation, or you shall be wet, or you shall know, right? Don't worry about the they. There is no they that actually does this. It's really more of a generic statement saying that these kinds of things will happen to you. All right, so again, in verse 26, notice that he says at the end, right, that till you know that the Most High rules in the kingdom of men and gives it to whomever he chooses. So this is a repeat of verse 17, right? So in verse 17, when Nebuchadnezzar listed the dream, this was part of what was in it. But now he's changed it and said that the only thing he's changed is that he says, till you know that the Most High rules in the kingdom of men. So this, again, he's saying this whole thing is very personal. It's about you, king, and you need to pay attention. All right, then we get down to verse 26. And inasmuch as they gave the command to leave the stump and the roots of the tree, your kingdom shall be assured to you after you come to know that heaven rules, or that God rules. So again, it's interesting, right? All these bad things are going to happen, but he is saying that your kingdom will remain in place, and we'll talk about more about that when we get to the actually what happens. But again, it's going to, these bad things are going to happen. Your kingdom is going to stay in place, and it shall be assured to you after you come to know that God rules, or that heaven rules, right? So again, yeah, we'll put these things in place. We'll hold on to your kingdom, but not until you understand that God rules, that God's in charge, that he's the boss, or are you going to get it back? So he kind of tells them right up front. All right, then verse 27, therefore, O king, let my advice be acceptable to you. Break off your sins from being righteous and your iniquities by showing mercy to the poor. Perhaps there may be a lengthening of your prosperity. Now, I don't know if this is just Daniel's hope in the middle of this, right? God has said these things are going to happen, and Daniel's saying, well, maybe if you turn around, if you do some good things, then maybe perhaps there will be a lengthening of your prosperity. Perhaps these things won't come against you, or maybe it's going to be a longer time before it does happen. He uses the word break off your sin. That word is typically associated with a yoke around an ox. He's kind of saying, take the yoke off, break away from the sins that have bound you. It's an interesting phrase that he uses there. And then he tells them to kind of give proof of that repentance, right, by doing these good deeds, showing mercy to the poor, right, being righteous. If you do those things, then God perhaps will lengthen your prosperity. So, obviously Nebuchadnezzar, he doesn't pay attention. So, go on to verse 28. Then all this came upon King Nebuchadnezzar. At the end of 12 months, he was walking about the royal palace of Babylon. The king spoke, saying, Is not this great Babylon that I have built for a royal dwelling by my mighty power and for the honor of my majesty? And while the word was still in the king's mouth, a voice fell from the heaven, King Nebuchadnezzar, to you it is spoken, the kingdom has departed from you. So we'll get back to that in a second. So it's interesting here, go back to verse 29, right? That at the end of 12 months, so God gives them another 12 months to repent, right? I mean, he essentially tells them this story, tells them this is going to happen. Daniel says, hey, if you try to, get rid of this sin and turn it around, maybe God will give you some additional time. And God actually waits 12 months before he actually brings the hammer down. It just shows the graciousness of God, right? He waits and waits and waits and waits and waits for us to turn ourselves around. And he gives Nebuchadnezzar all the benefit of the doubt here before he brings the hammer down. Is because, finally, Nebuchadnezzar in verse 30, kind of the straw that breaks the camel's back, right? He's up on his palace somewhere, and he says, Isn't this amazing what I've done? I'm so incredible. I've made all these things happen, all my mighty power, all my majesty, right? He's taking credit for everything that's happened in his life. So there's no recognition of all the things that he's already seen God do, right? He's already seen God do many things in his life and in his kingdom's life. There's no recognition of God's mercy for him, his provision, of God's sovereignty. There's none of that. It's all about him. It's all about what I have accomplished. So I got to just pause here and say, how do we fall into the same pattern, right? How do we, and we probably don't say it out loud like Nebuchadnezzar does here, but we say it internally about how amazing I am and look what I have accomplished, and look how people respect me for what I've done, and how important I am, and all that kind of stuff. That internal messaging that's going on, rather than actually recognizing that God has given us everything. God has put us in the position. He allowed us to be born in this country. He allowed us to have friends and family. He allowed us to have education. I mean, and we don't pay attention to that. It's not on the forefront of our mind. And so as a result of that, the next step in our journey, we're not depending upon God, right? We're not recognizing that God is going to determine what's the next step, what's going to happen in the next 5 years. It's all going to be determined by God, not by how clever we are or how we figure out what we're going to do. God is going to determine what the steps are to help us. And I think Nebuchadnezzar obviously is not there, nowhere near there. But I'm afraid we fall into the same pattern. We may not. Obviously, we don't rule Babylon, but in our own little place, we think pretty highly of ourselves. So, and maybe that's just me, and it doesn't apply to the rest of you, so that's okay. All right, let's keep going. Verse 31. While the word was still in the king's mouth, a voice fell from heaven. King Nebuchadnezzar, to you it is spoken, the kingdom has departed from you. And they shall drive you from men, your dwelling shall be with the beasts of the field. They shall make you eat grass like oxen, and 7 times shall pass over you, until you know that the Most High rules in the kingdom of men and gives it to whomever he chooses. So again, that phrase comes back, right? We saw it in verse 17. We saw it back in whatever it was, verse 25 or 26. And we see it here again. The whole point of this happening is so that you understand that God's in charge. He rules. It's his kingdom. He chooses who's in charge of it. And verse 33 then, that very hour the word was fulfilled concerning Nebuchadnezzar. He was driven from men, and he ate grass like oxen. His body was wet with the dew of heaven, till his hair had grown like eagle's feathers, and his nails like bird's claws. So we see here. Nebuchadnezzar is driven from the kingdom, driven from his kingdom. He somehow turns into some kind of animal. It's very interesting. The commentaries love this part, and there's chapters and chapters written on what has happened to him here, and what's the medical condition that he really had, and all that blah blah blah. In all honesty, I don't care about all that. I think what we see here is that Nebuchadnezzar has lost his mind somehow, and he is forced out into the fields, and he's eating grass. Some of the commentaries said they probably put him out in the royal gardens. They kind of probably had a zoo out there, and they just put him out with the rest of the animals. And his hair is growing long, his fingernails are growing long, right? And he's completely lost his mind. The very interesting thing to me in the midst of this, right, is that he, while all this is occurring, right, he's out there in the field with the animals. Nobody takes over. Nobody takes over the kingdom, right? Nobody rises up and says, "Well, this guy's a crazy man. We're just going to we're going to take over Babylon." That does not happen. And of course, this goes right back to there's going to be an iron band around the stump, and the root is going to remain, and it's going to come back. I mean, it fulfills that prophecy, but that prophecy being fulfilled is surprising. I guess I just want to make sure you recognize that would not be normal under these circumstances. And you got to wonder what role Daniel played in that, right? So he's probably prime minister, right? The king's gone nuts. He's a good friend of his. He's probably trying to hold the kingdom together during this time period. He probably plays a very important role in keeping the kingdom stable during Nebuchadnezzar's crazy time, if you will. So it's just something. It's interesting. It's an interesting thing to think about what actually occurred during this time period. I will say historically, if we go back, historically and look at what actually happened to Nebuchadnezzar. There's kind of a quiet period at the end of his reign in historical books. Now, remember, history books in this era would not write anything bad about the king, right? It would all be, this guy did glorious works and he built wonderful things, blah, blah, blah. And there's lots of that stuff written about Nebuchadnezzar. But during the end of his reign, they don't have much to say about his kingdom. It's very quiet. And so what's interesting here is obviously Daniel has a lot to say about this near the end of his reign here, but none of that is reported in the historical works. It's all simply here in Daniel. There's a comment?
Do you think that Daniel told everybody else who was maybe going to try to usurp power or whatever, that the same interpretation of the dream, that hey, it's only going to be 7 years and Nebuchadnezzar is going to be restored?
I don't know. I mean, that's what I'm saying. It's kind of fascinating that a cousin, uncle, child, somebody didn't take over this kingdom and say, well, the guy's nuts. It does show, to me, it shows the amazing authority that Daniel had at this point in time, I think, to kind of hold all this together. During, Nebuchadnezzar does, we'll see, right? He does regain his mind. He comes back and rules on the throne for a little while longer, but it's kind of amazing. Yeah, it may be, Jim, that's what he's doing. He's saying, hey, this prophecy is there. And at this point, they respect Daniel's word, but it's kind of amazing to me that it doesn't happen. So
would you even think the masses knew? If he was in the royal garden.
That's what's weird, right? Did they hide him off in a secret garden so he could run around naked and eat the grass, right? Or is he out there for public display? And like I said, the commentaries say both. Some of them say he was hidden away. Some say no, this was a very public thing. Everybody knew the king had gone crazy. So I don't know. It's all based upon the words that we're reading right here in Daniel. So there's no other. What I wanted to mention, there's no other historical reference that gives us any other indication as to what really is going on. So hard to know. Any other comments here?
Well, I think the fact that Daniel was able to interpret the first dream when he was not only able to interpret it, but he was able to divine it. God gave him that. Where the other the Chaldeans, the magicians, the sorcerers, none of them had a clue. So when Daniel interpreted this dream, I think that the sorcerers probably knew what the interpretation was, or could have known, but
yeah, I agree.
Were afraid to tell him. And when they knew that Daniel told him and was able to, or interpreted the dream and was able to tell him, that had to have elevated Daniel to a pretty high position of authority. He was second in command anyway, but that probably established his credibility among those who would try to usurp the power.
And you also raise a good point in my head in that, since they did interpret the dream, maybe they kind of understood that that he was going to come back also after 7 years, right? So Daniel saying that, they all may have said, yeah, that's right, so we probably shouldn't, make sure someone doesn't usurp the throne here. So I don't know. It's just an interesting point that happens. All right, let's go on to wherever we are, verse 34. Yeah. So before we do that, I just wanted you to point out in verse 31, while the word was still in his mouth, a voice fell from heaven. I don't know what that is, but it reminds me kind of a thundering voice from heaven, right? That comes down and says, watch out, Nebuchadnezzar, you're in big trouble now. I like it when God kind of speaks into the world, and I think he's done it here, right? When Nebuchadnezzar has all of his pride built up, all of a sudden God just speaks right into the world and says, your reign is over, Neb. All right, let's go on to verse wherever we are, 34. So here in verse 34, Nebuchadnezzar now picks up the story, right? We had from 19 to 33, we had Daniel telling the story. Now Nebuchadnezzar picks the story back up again in verse 34. He says, at the end of that time, I, Nebuchadnezzar, lifted my eyes to heaven, and my understanding returned to me, and I blessed the Most High, and praised and honored him who lives forever. For his dominion is an everlasting dominion, his kingdom is from generation to generation. All the inhabitants of the earth are reputed as nothing. He does according to his will in the army of heaven, and among the inhabitants of earth no one can restrain his hand, or say to him, what have we done? So first of all, it's just interesting that Nebuchadnezzar picks back up the story, right? Obviously, while he's crazy, he can't tell the story, and so Daniel's telling the story. But now that he's got his senses back, he picks the story back up. It's fascinating to me. And then he makes these amazing statements about the Most High, right? Again, it's to repeat some of it of what we read in verses 1 through 3 as he kind of introed the story. But he talks about his dominion being everlasting. His kingdom from generation to generation. And then he goes on to talk about, right, all the inhabitants of the earth are reputed as nothing. He does according to his will. In other words, God does according to what he wants. He doesn't listen. He doesn't, have to listen to anyone except his own statements. No one can restrain his hand, i.e., I, Nebuchadnezzar, cannot restrain his hand. And these statements that Nebuchadnezzar is making about the Most High are pretty amazing statements. So, as we said last week, there are many people who believe that at this point, this is Nebuchadnezzar's salvation experience, if you will. This is when he understands that God is the true and one God. There are other commentaries who say, no, he's still saying the Most High God, not the only God, right? He's not making that distinction. He's still just putting him as the God above all the other gods, but he's not, we've still got all these other gods that I'm still going to worship. It's unclear. In all honesty, I'm not taking a position on it. It could be one way or the other, but it's kind of amazing some of the statements that Nebuchadnezzar makes about God in here, that he has this kind of irresistible will in heaven, on earth. Nothing can stop him. No one can question him. It's kind of a shocking place that Nebuchadnezzar gets to after these things happen to him.
Hey, Rich, at the very start of 34, it says at the end of the time, and my note says literally days.
It says at the end of days?
It says literally time translated to days.
Yeah, so that time is the same time, if you remember, where is it? Where it talks about seven, where is it? 7 times, back in 32, right? It says, they shall eat the grass of the oxen, and 7 times shall pass over you. It's the same word, right? And so the interpretation is unclear, whether that's moments or days or months or years. So most of the commentators agree that it's probably more like years than anything else. And so the same word is used in 32 is used in 34. So at the end of the time, so it's the end of the 7 times, whatever that is. It's and mostly most of the commentators say it's years. So I'm surprised that it has days there. That would be an unusual translation.
Yeah, it's funny because earlier in 32 it translates the times to possibly years, but in 34 it says days. So.
Yeah, and it's the same word. So interesting. Yeah.
Are you saying that it's not clear that it's a true conversion at that point? Is that what you were saying earlier?
I'm saying it's not clear to the commentaries. Commentaries come into. Yeah, go ahead.
Because I'm just thinking like when it goes back to 25, it's, why this is happening. It says on 25, you'll eat the grass, the cattle, and be drenched, etc. 7 periods of time will pass over you until you recognize. So to me, that tells me he does recognize at that point.
He does recognize that the Most High rules in the kingdom of men. There's no question about that. He gets that. He gets that God decides who's going to rule. He decides who's going to be in charge. What's not clear is whether he rejects all of his other gods. That's not clear from this.
Okay.
That's all. There's no question that he's made a dramatic transformation. And listen, I have no problem agreeing that he's saved at this point in time. I have no problem with that. Okay. I'm just saying that that the commentaries are split on it. That's all. All right, so verse 36 then. At the same time, my reason returned to me, and for the glory of my kingdom, my honor and splendor returned to me. My counselors and nobles resorted to me. I was restored to my kingdom, and excellent majesty was added to me. Now I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise and extol the honor of the King of heaven, all of whose works are truth, his ways justice, and those who walk in pride he is able to put down. So Debbie, I read those verses and I go, man, I'm on that side of saying he was saved. If he makes those kinds of statements, yeah. I can get there without any problem whatsoever. So it's, again, I'm just letting you know that there's a disagreement in the commentaries, Howard. That's all. So he's returned to his kingdom. He's put back in charge again. This is very much near the end of his reign. So it's not like he's not put back in charge for a very long time, but he is put back in charge. He does reign in the kingdom for some time after this. As I said in the beginning, I think he reigned for until he was in his 80s. He reigned for like 70 years, so he had quite a long reign. And we see when we get to chapter 5, we have a new king, and we'll talk about the transition when we get there. But that he praised and extolled the honor of the King of heaven, all of whose works are truth, his ways justice, those who walk in pride he is able to put down. So again, he has gotten the message, right? The message was that the message was about his pride, right? It was all about his pride and him thinking that he was the one who did all these things. He finally gets at the end that he's able to put down those who walk in pride, and that God is really the one who rules in heaven. So the other thing just to mention here is that this whole story of Nebuchadnezzar is a metaphor of the nation of Israel. So this story is a metaphor for the Israelite people, right? Because they're in Babylon because of their disobedience, because of their pride, right? But he's trying to let them know that there's a stump that remains, right? There's a root that remains. So this whole story is a source of hope for them, right? That they will return, that Israel will be brought back, etc. So that's also a part of this story that is certainly as one of the reasons that Daniel puts it in here is not only to tell the story of Nebuchadnezzar, but also as a model, as a metaphor for Israel. Hey, you guys are in distress right now, but there's always going to be a stump. There's always going to be a root that will return. And of course, we see that same metaphor carry that all the way to Jesus, right? Being that stump, being that root that remains for Christians. So I do want to finish this part. I'm kind of amazed how quickly we went through that. I have to slow down. I want to go back to Psalm chapter 2. Turn there. Psalm chapter 2 is a nice summary of this whole story from a completely different perspective. I just want to read that with you. In fact, why don't I get one of you to read it for me? All I do is talk all the time. Just read the whole psalm to us, if you don't mind.
Why do the nations rage and the peoples plot in vain? The kings of the earth set themselves, and the rulers take counsel together against the Lord and against his anointed, saying, let us burst their bonds apart and cast away their cords from us. He who sits in the heavens laughs, and the Lord holds them in derision. And he will speak to them in his wrath and terrify them in his fury, saying, as for me, I have set my king on Zion, my holy hill. I will tell of the decree that the Lord sent to me. You are my son, today I have begotten you. Ask of me, and I will make the nations your heritage, and the ends of the earth your possession. You shall break them with a rod of iron, and dash them in pieces like a potter's vessel. Now therefore, O kings, be wise, be warned, O rulers of the earth. Serve the Lord with fear, and rejoice with trembling. Kiss the Son, lest he be angry, and you perish in the way, for his wrath is quickly kindled. Blessed are all who take refuge in him.
Right, isn't that amazing? It's an amazing summary of really what we've learned in Daniel chapter 4. I love verse 4. Right, I mean, I can just see God in heaven when all these kingdoms go up and they're the greatest kingdom and we're amazing, right? And God's just giggling in heaven, going, "Are you kidding me? Do you not realize how stupid you look and sound? That you're going to be in charge and you're going to take control." From his perspective, it's just little ants kind of scurrying around. And I also then love the ending, right? I mean, blessed are all those who put their trust in him, right? Put their trust in God, put their trust in his Son. That's where the blessing comes. Not in those nations who rage and plot vain things, which is unfortunately what goes on in most of the nations. So again, the lesson of Daniel chapter 4 is about pride. It is the key verse was in verse 17, to know that the Most High rules in the kingdom of men and gives it to whomever he will. So I'm done early. This doesn't happen very often. I actually thought I was going to go over because we had so many verses. Blah, 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 blah. So what else?
Just since you have an extra minute, I think we were talking about doing a class thing on Friday night at Jimmy DeGreek's.
This Friday?
Yes, if that works.
This coming Friday.
Yes.
Okay, that'd be great.
Okay, I'll put it out there on the prayer request.
Good.
What time?
I'm sorry.
So I have an idea.
Uh-oh.
He has an idea.
Uh-oh.
6:15.
This was just an easy way to solve this problem for this month.
Yeah.
So what came to me was we could actually just circulate a piece of paper, with it, and have everybody put a place that they'd like to go, and we just do that. Periodically, we just go. The next time we'll go. We either go alphabetical or something like that, and just say, okay. The Ancliffs are first. They were on here and they wanted to go to such and such, or you can have it at your house, anything like that, and we'll pick it, and then we just try to pick a date that's, maybe we'll do something like every 6 weeks or something like that.
Can we pick your house?
And so.
You've done it.
I used to buy a house.
Denise, though, is not here.
You just try to pick my house, we may leave. But I just thought about that and said, that way, maybe we can get a whole variety of everybody getting some input in, and then we'll just, whenever we hit the person's item, we'll say, hey, what date is available for you, and let them kind of drive the date and try to work it like that. And I don't know, just something to
Sounds good. That's a good idea.
work off of.
Takes 5 years to get.
Make it so.
It'll take a little while, 6 weeks, every 6 weeks or so.
We like Romans.
And if,
Romans.
and if somebody doesn't want to do that, they don't have to, they don't have to come up with a place, we can skip them or whatever.
We'll pick your house.
Pick back to my house, back to Michelle's house.
Stephanie wants to go in reverse.
Joe and I went to the Surrey seafood restaurant last night. Telling you that they've kind of opened under new management up there, and it was really good. So you may not have to go. That's a long ways for a social, but any of you who go out to restaurants, it's worth going to now. It was they had closed down to kind of revamp, and they were very good.
They're now run by Smithville Station.
All right, let me close this in prayer, and then we'll let you guys have your prayer time and such. Dear Lord, we just thank you for this book, Father. It does, this story of Nebuchadnezzar is the story, unfortunately, of all of us, Father, in our pride, as we think how amazing we are and what we've accomplished and how important we are in our own story. Father, not recognizing that it's just your story and we're just a player in it. Father, we just ask you to help us to recognize you better. Help us to see you in the day in and day out, rather than just think about you once a week or something, Father. Lord, just give us that such that we don't fall into the same trap that Nebuchadnezzar fell into and need the kind of kick in the pants that Nebuchadnezzar got in order for him to recognize your place, Father. Lord, we just ask you to be with us today as we go into the worship time. We just thank you now in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.
All right, see you guys. Have a good week.
Friday
Friday night. See you Friday night.
What time?
What time? What time?
6:15.
What?
6:15.
6:15. Okay. Good night.
Bye.
Good night.